Good evening. My name is Renee Battle Brooks. I'm the Executive Director of the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights. We are the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. 2022 actually marks our agency's 50th anniversary. We're excited about that. We spent this year continuing our commitment to combat discrimination in our county and our region.
Hi, everyone. I think we may have lost Renee Battlebrooks, who's our executive director. So I'm going to just jump in here for a minute on behalf of the Office of Human Rights and welcome you all with us this evening. As Renee was saying, we have spent the last year combating discrimination around the region. This year, 2022, is actually our 50th anniversary of our agency. And so we really wanted to spend this year working on honoring the legacy of Teresa Douglas Banks, who was a Prince George's County advocate, leader. She was a politician, she was a teacher, and she was somebody who fought tirelessly for the formation of our agency. And so we really have looked at her spirit of dedication and community involvement for the last, throughout our whole history, but really for 2022. So this is our last major event for 2022. And we do that with, again, honoring and appreciation of Teresa Douglas Banks. We thank all of you being with us this evening. Tonight, we are gathered for really a critical conversation. You've seen the title, Can Minorities Also Be Bigoted? We brought this together in response to advertised, shared, divisive and hateful rhetoric. And we know that those comments destroy the fabric of our community. Like, they harm individuals and they make our nation less safe. I had a conversation with a neighbor the other day, a Jewish woman. Her family came here from Austria after World War II. Her family lost hundreds of relatives. And she stood in our parking lot and told me that it was the first time in her life that she had to seriously consider if she needed to flee the United States. And so that's really what we're here to talk about today. And so what I'd like to do to get us started is ask each of you, we have 5 absolutely honored guests. So what we like to do is to ask each of you just to take a few minutes, introduce yourself, your name, your affiliation, and also how come you chose to join the conversation with us this evening. So I'm going to get maybe Dr. Marsh, if you could start.
Absolutely. It's such a pleasure to be here. And it's so nice that you were able to step in as Renee Battle was, she had problems with her Wi-Fi. So that's just great. So we thank you. I'm excited to be here. I'm Dr. Marsh. I'm a sociologist and demographer at the University of Maryland, College Park. All of my research hinges around race. I have a book coming out early next year looking at people that are single and living alone in the Black middle class. So I try to understand consequences of being the Black middle class and avenues into the Black middle class. I'm teaching 2 phenomenal classes, or taught, my semester's over, 2 phenomenal classes this semester. One is on the Boondocks, and I'm trying to understand the racial commentary that threads through the entire episodes of the Boondocks. I also am teaching a class on race, class, gender, and sports, and how we think about these isms as it relates to sports. And so I have had a phenomenal semester and so happy to end my semester having this conversation with you. And the reason why this conversation is so incredibly important to me, and because I talk about race, and in particular, I talk about and think about Black folks, I really kind of want to talk about how anti-Blackness permeates through social institutions, all social institutions, and even Black folks and people of color can have anti-Black sentiments. And so I hope we can kind of extend the conversation and talk about that some today.
Thank you very much. And Rahmah, could we have you introduce yourself next?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Rahmah Abdulaleem, and I'm the Executive Director of Karama Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights, which is the oldest women-led Muslim nonprofit in the United States. And in 2023, we'll be celebrating our 30th year, so we're quite excited. I came to this conversation because as a Muslim here in America, we deal with Islamophobia so much, but we also deal with a lot of intra-community bigotry. And it's something that Muslims don't want to always talk about. We want to be like, oh, everybody's being so mean to the Muslims. It's like, what about how we're treating each other? And it goes to actually what Dr. Marsh was talking about, because, after everything that happened with George Floyd in 2020, we started really having some discussions about anti-Blackness in the Muslim community. And a lot of people were in denial. And it was something that we have been taking the time to really educate people, because it's one of those things that people are like, oh, I'm a Muslim. And, from my holy book, it says this. And, our prophet says this. Okay, but what do you do? And I think that that's what the conversation needs to come to, is that a lot of people like to rely on their scripture or, someone important in their religion and say, I can't be racist because of this. And everybody can be racist. Everyone can be bigoted. And we need to address that and say, okay, I have these issues and let's talk about it. So that's why I decided to come to the conversation tonight.
Awesome. Excuse me. Thank you. Welcome. And Rabbi Abbi, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Rabbi Abbi Sharofsky. I'm the Director of Intergroup Relations and Rabbi in Residence for the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington, also known as the JCRC. The JCRC is also a longstanding institution throughout the country, but especially in Greater Washington, where we are an advocacy organization. We work in many areas of government to lobby for things such as security measures for houses of worship, both Jewish and other faiths, as well as things like food insecurity issues and housing and other issues that impact a broader community that, as people of faith, we truly care about. We also do a lot of work in schools, educating about what is the experience of a Jewish child in the public school setting today. We do this through peer-to-peer education, through direct conversations with administrators and teachers. And then there's my specialty, which is intergroup work and interfaith work, where I get to talk with people and meet with people and build relationships across various borders on what does it mean to what's going on right now for the Jewish community, and what does it mean to have for a priest or an imam or a people from the Sikh community or the Hindu community, et cetera, to have access to a rabbi to ask those kinds of questions of what's going on, what is that thing? So that's what I get to do as a rabbi, and I love it. And why I'm here today is it's not easy right now being Jewish in America. The numbers, the numbers are horrible in terms of anti-Semitism and issues of anti-Semitism and reports and incidents. But beyond the numbers, it's right there. It's in everyone. It's right up front. Right before I got on, I was catching up on some Saturday Night Live, and there are so many things going on with the intersections of how different communities, especially the communities that I'm honored to be speaking with tonight, where have our communities, where's the Jewish community and the Muslim community, or the Jewish community and parts of the Black community fallen apart, and what can we do to get back together? So that's why I'm here.
Great. Thank you so much. And then Amy Fry, would you take a moment and introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Thank you. Good evening. First, I do want to thank the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights for inviting me to be part of this really important conversation. I'm honored to share this space with the other speakers on this panel this evening. My name is Amy Jean Chung Fry, and I use she and her for pronouns. I'm currently logging into this panel discussion from the stolen lands of the Piscataway Conoy tribes, that's presently known as Cheverly, Maryland, where I serve as the vice mayor for our town. However, for my day job, I am the Anti-Hate Program Associate for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. So we're a national nonprofit organization, and our mission is to advance civil and human rights for Asian Americans and to build a fair and equitable society for all. It's in that last part of our mission statement that I'm just extra grateful this evening to be part of this needed and important conversation. I know that in order to fight white supremacy and the hate and extremist violence that's plaguing our country, we have to work collectively and collaboratively to really unlearn the subtle racist behaviors that are so often normalized, learn more about our collective stories and our histories. And I know that we individually as well as a community, really need to challenge the anti-Blackness that's so pervasive in the systems in which this country is built on. So that's kind of why I'm here. I just really wanted to be part of the conversation, to learn from some of the other speakers. Hopefully I'll be able to contribute a little bit in my small ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Rod Martinez, could you tell us about yourself, please?
Sure. I'm really excited to be here. Already looking at the comments, a question about racism and power systems, and of course, all things that sociologists study and that we're really interested in. So, hi everyone. My name is Rod Martinez, and I'm a sociologist at the University of Maryland with the wonderful Kris Marsh. My research generally falls along the intersections of race, gender, social movements, and the criminal legal system. I'm interested in this conversation for a lot of different reasons. I think personally, there's a lot of attachment to this conversation, but also professionally, some of my work looks at not just conflict between groups of people, intergroup conflict, but also the times that when we actually get along, right? So there's a lot of times a lot of emphasis on again, those points of tension and conflict, but there's really a longer historical lineage of different races of people, different ethnic groups working alongside each other, which I think is really key to really, shaping up the progressive society that we want to envision. And so I specifically look at that in the context of Black and Latinx relations, right, in the US context, which I think has some interesting parallels here that we'll hopefully get into a little bit.
All right, wonderful. Thank you all so much. So for those of you watching, you probably realize that our host, Renee Battlebrook, who is the executive director of the Office of Human Rights, had a little bit of technology problems. So I'm going to fill in for her until she gets back, which hopefully will be soon, because she's such a wonderful moderator. I think most of our guests have worked with her before, and a lot of you viewers have probably seen her. And one thing that happened backstage, I do know what her first question is because she did talk about it backstage. So I'm going to start with Renee's opening question, and then I've got some other things I would like to ask. But before I pose Renee's opening question, I'd like to talk to the panelists really quickly. Are you comfortable having a panel discussion? Would you like me to specifically call on people? Are you good if I just throw the question out and you jump in as is comfortable?
I just say throw it out and we jump in. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I know that one of the questions that we had, and we had talked when we were planning this, we met with the rabbi earlier as we were planning this event. And one of the things we were talking about is, for want of a better phrase, dog whistles that are used about certain communities, expressions that are maybe not overt, but give certain signals. And so we are wondering sort of what are some of those, as much as you feel comfortable saying them, because I also think there can be harm in saying them, but to the extent to which you feel comfortable sharing some of those, and what is the impact on your community or on you when you hear these kinds of terms? Anyone?
If it's okay, I'll jump right in, especially because I feel like that this question I'm partially responsible for it, so I will take some ownership there. Anti-Semitism, as I've said in other spaces, is one of the oldest hatreds, and a key thing to know about anti-Semitism is it's not linear. It moves like this. It's a squiggle, and it goes through waves. So Jewish communities throughout the world will go through periods of time of feeling relatively safe, secure, but it's also historically that has not been a guarantee. So there is this sense of moving through the world with that. Some of the tropes and these, you can Google, there are many definitions. I'm not going to give one specific definition, but thinking about the tropes and the dog whistles that we're seeing today, the ones that we're seeing in media today, especially, have to do with power and this idea of punching up. And what is it about anti-Semitism, and what is it about this very specific hatred of Jews. Anti-Semitism is the hatred of Jewish people for being Jewish people. It's nothing to do with our religion, with our faith, how we pray, what we do. It's simply, it's about peoplehood and who we are as an entity. So the idea that Jews have power and use that power and are able to use that power to do such outlandish things as make space lasers that cause fires, that cause wildfires. Like to thank a member of Congress for that one. But also some things that you look around and it.
I think she got stuck, but just to build on something that Rabbi Abbi said, what I think is very fascinating is that, like the member of Congress who said that, thing that she just described, that's an obvious dog whistle and it's loud and everybody can see it for what it is. I think the more dangerous ones are the ones that don't sound like they're dog whistles. They sound like legitimate ideas. And I think those are the ones that are more concerning to all of our groups, is that it's things that we're like, if they had said just one more thing, everybody could understand that, it's inappropriate. But because they said it, are you just being too sensitive? And I think that, I'm sure that when Rabbi Abbi gets back on, I'm sure she gets like, you guys are just being too sensitive. Like, what's the big deal? It's not that bad. And, I think that that's what's always interesting to me, is that I constantly get well, why do you have that thing on your head? And I'm like, okay, would you like the information about why I'm doing that? Or are you just making a derogatory comment? Or because of my coloring, why don't you go back to your country? And me chuckling saying, well, because you don't know anything about my faith. You don't realize that I'm African-American. And guess what? My people were here before you guys. Like, it gets down to that point. And it's like a constant, like, justifying not just I'm a Muslim, but that I'm an African-American. And it's the bigotry that comes out when you're kind of like, oh, I don't think you belong here. It's like, really, thank you, Amy, for like identifying the native land that you're on. It's like, we all act like this is our own space and like, oh, we all got here different ways. And I think that sometimes the dog whistles are so smooth that you don't realize that they're dog whistles. And it's only people who are doing the work that are like, oh, that's a dog whistle. Okay, Rabbi Abbi, I didn't want to cut you off, but go ahead.
I have no idea what went on. All of a sudden, the screen, like all of the little screens just went like black little swirlies and I'm kicked out. And I know how you felt, Renee. I have empathy in this moment.
Yes, thank you. Actually, my lights went out, like all the electricity went out. I'm on generator, but I had to reboot anyway.
Oh, I didn't have it that bad. I don't know. It's just, I could say cut out while I was talking about anti-Semitism because of anti-Semitism. So that's, it's flippant, and I apologize for that flippancy. And I really, truly don't know where I left off. I guess, thank you, Rahmah, for, giving me back the space. The media is rough. The things that come up, like we said, the space lasers, but the more complicated things are the issues of power and who wields power. And a disproportionate amount of power is attributed to Jews and the Jewish community, especially in areas like Hollywood, the media, the press. And when issues come up with, a certain performer, when Kanye West put out certain tweets, the tweets were scary. And the things that he said were deeply problematic. For me and for many in the Jewish community, what was even scarier was the normalization by others in, both in the Black community and beyond the Black community of what he said, by dismissing it or turning it into a joke. Before we started, I went back and because I purposefully did not watch it when it aired, but I went back and I watched the video of Dave Chappelle's monologue from Saturday Night Live. And because I figured if I'm going to talk from November 12th, said if I'm going to talk about this, I need to see it and I need to know what I'm talking about. And it was painful. It was painful that he turned a, disclaimer on anti-Semitism is bad into a joke. It was painful that people laughed. And he is an extremely talented writer and comedian who has used his talent to harm another group. And that's painful. And by saying, we talk about the dog whistles, he pulled them right out there. And then also used words like they, or they're going to come after me. And those theys, that's the Jews. So that's a huge thing that we're, dealing with right now, which then breeds into the horrible cycle of people in the Jewish community saying, well, this is what the Black community is saying. And this is why are we standing with them if they're not standing with us? And then you look at, a couple weeks later, Kanye West is having, lunch with Nick Fuentes, a major white supremacist, and you realize, oh, okay, so this is how people are being manipulated right now to drive wedges between minority communities and make, because if we're at odds with each other, they can get in there and break us down. And that's a huge trope. How are we giving disproportionate amount of power to a people that is so relatively small in this country? So
if I could just say one thing, that same trope and what you just talked about, I actually saw reflected in conversation with people that are seemingly, well educated and understand in the Black community about taking it, I guess probably what Dave Chappelle, I didn't watch it, but when Kanye West lost his contract with whatever big mega company, they said, see,
Adidas,
it's true.
yes.
So it's very, very disturbing. But so before we move on, because I do want to hear the other tropes from other perspectives, I would like to get a sociological perspective.
I'll chime in and then Rod can chime in if he wants to. And Santa Claus is on a fire truck, so you might hear Santa Claus going by on the fire truck as I'm speaking. Don't know if you can hear him or not. Can you hear him?
Yeah, but it's good.
Okay, great. Okay. So here, and yeah, I appreciate what you said, Rabbi, because I think the response is in your response. Y'all don't hear that? Okay.
Yeah, but it's not too loud.
So white supremacy is working effectively and efficiently because we've got all this infighting. That's exactly what white supremacy is meant to do. So we're feeding into making white supremacy effective and efficient because we're having all the infighting. That's exactly what it's supposed to do. So unfortunately, we're helping it to perpetuate itself, to sustain itself, to give life to it, and to give breath to it. As opposed to trying to dismantle it, we're giving life to it because of this infighting that we're having. So I just want to contextualize that a bit, but it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do.
Yeah. Rod, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that I think as sociologists, it's really interesting when people focus on individual people because we tend to look at racism on an institutional systemic level, right? And who has power at those levels, right? So I don't think none of what Kanye's saying is right, like the empirical reality, right? Obviously, racist tropes that are, as you were saying, Rabbi, some of the oldest in the book. But and so it's always interesting because there's a layer of celebrity and public figures doing this, and I think that's what makes it much more dangerous, right? A few weeks back, there was the comments by the LA council members, the Latinx council members who said some very anti-Black things, right? And, I think it was right for folks to call them out on it, right? And all of the anti-Blackness. But at the same time, I was like, let's look at those budget sheets. Let's look at the decision-making, right? Because that's truly where the power and resources, right? And a lot of the institutional power and racism, right? really comes out and people feel on a deeper magnitude, right? So it's really interesting that this conversation is also layered with like celebrity, public figures, politicians, right? And they're the ones like, peddling, these racist tropes and ideas. But yeah, it's really interesting to think about, that dynamic, because as sociologists, we're so used to talking about things at a very institutional or systemic level.
Yeah, no, that's great. Amy, Rahmah, want to jump in with tropes from your various perspectives and what they are and why they're dangerous?
Rahmah, do you want to go ahead or? Okay. Well, I guess I'll start off with kind of just off of what Dr. Marsh said, and just this idea that it's doing exactly what it's supposed to. Two of the biggest myths that the Asian American communities face is the model minority myth, as well as the perpetual foreigner myth. So, and Rahmah kind of touched on that as well. But I mean, the model minority myth was created specifically to use Asian Americans as a wedge to basically say that because of their own strong work ethic and their family values or respect for authority or whatnot, that this is what has made them successful in this country, whereas these traits were absent in other communities. And so we continue to see Asian Americans used as a wedge under this kind of myth, even with affirmative action, despite the fact that it's proven that most Asian Americans are for affirmative action with the Supreme Court. So, that's one of the various, I think, tropes that fall under that myth. And then the other one being the perpetual foreigner myth, which, where are you really from? Wow, you speak really good English. There might be the, oh, you eat dogs conversations. And then, just like even jokes, especially now around COVID-19 and having had, some of our highest elected officials calling it China virus or Kung flu, right? And then, someone's coughing, like while they're walking down the street, and people will be like, oh, that person has COVID just because they're Asian. Or like when Asian people wear a mask, it's assumed because they do have COVID and they're dirty or they're spreading it. Or if they don't, then there's a concern that, so it doesn't, there's like a no win-win. And I think a lot of the real fear, like Rahmah, you said, it's like some of it is obvious, right? Some of it you can just like kind of pick right out and be like that. And then there's other ones where you're like, ooh, that made me feel kind of weird. I can't pinpoint exactly why. And then once you start to process it a little, it all comes back to white supremacy, right? It all comes back to anti-Blackness and like just kind of how it is just so normalized to the point where we have a hard time recognizing it. And then when people say, oh, it was just a joke, lighten up, it's not a big deal. You look like the one who's being overly sensitive when you're being gaslit. And so I think sometimes it's really having the courage, just even with friends, right? To be like, that what you said right there, just, because if I laugh along, the next thing, oh no, oh, am I back? Okay. If I laugh along, they're going to be like, well, my Asian friend over there thought it was funny. And then they'll just kind of continue with it, right? So it really is one of those things that sometimes we have to have those uncomfortable conversations. But I think it's important that we do, because otherwise it grows into these bigger issues that we see that can cause real harm.
Yeah. And I feel like I missed some of the conversation, trying to get back on. But Rahmah, did you already sort of talk about it?
I just want to add just one more layer, is that as a Muslim woman, I often get a lot of gendered Islamophobia towards me. And so it's something that people are like, why are you being so sensitive? Don't your men keep you guys in line? And something like that is obvious. But then other times it's just like, oh, you're a lawyer? You guys are allowed to be lawyers? And so the gender that comes out as well. So that, to me, it's many layers of bigotry that come out. And you're constantly like, are you kidding me? Like, what are you going to come up with today? And it's sometimes people who you think are your friends, they're the ones who are saying stuff. And it's like, as Amy just mentioned, it's like sometimes you have to catch them right then to tell them, you know what? That's not appropriate. You don't say that, don't repeat it. And it's obvious when you hear young children say stuff and you're like, who did you hear that from? Because you're clearly not old enough to even know that terminology. You are, commenting on something you have no idea about because you are hearing it from other people. So really thinking about even how we talk around our children to say, is it appropriate to say things like that, so that they are just like continuing this kind of ongoing, like we'll never really fight bigotry if we don't address it.
Can I chime in for just a second?
Please.
So one of the things that I've talked to, I do work on like singlehood and kind of like the discrimination against singles. But one of the things that I've talked to officers, I've talked to my students about, and I think that one of the ways to kind of like respond when somebody says something that's racist, sexist, homophobic, or xenophobic, I think one of the easiest, but I mean, of course we can cuss them out from Amazing Grace to how sweet it is, right? I mean, we can, right? But then of course, if I do that, then I'm the angry Black woman. I just feed into that trope, right? I think one of the most benign ways we can get them to look at the error in their ways is to simply say, what do you mean by that? It's benign, it's non-confrontational, but it forces people to stop and pause. So what's typically going to happen, what they're going to say is like, oh, that's probably going to be their first response. I'm like, well, I kind of don't know. Can you explain? And then they're going to stutter, they're going to stammer over their words. And one of two things is going to happen. They're either going to say, oh, never mind, or else they're going to dig themselves into a hole and realize that it's racist, sexist, homophobic, or xenophobic what they're saying. You don't always have to cuss them out. You can if you want to. But another way of getting at that, and we don't want to use, Rabbi, we don't want to use profanity. But if we did, we could. But if you don't want to do that, I think that's a really benign way to get people to see the error in their ways. And at some point, they will understand and they'll just stop, be like, well, never mind. And have them go home and think about it too. So you're not the only one that's thinking about it.
Yeah, I think that is powerful. You know, part of the title of our panel discussion tonight, you know, can minorities also be bigoted, is I want to say probably a couple of weeks ago, I was watching, you know, just getting my nerd on. I like to watch C-SPAN and different things, you know, that my husband finds boring and other people do too. But it was sort of this discussion. And what I was hearing was, well, I mean, as this particular thing, as Black people, we cannot be racist. By definition, I'm like, I don't understand. So can somebody help me understand? I'll throw it to you, Dr. Kris, or soon to be Dr. Rod. Like, what's going on? What is that?
Let's tag team it.
You know what?
I said, let's tag team it.
All right, I'm going to start and Rob's going to finish it. And Rabbi has herself unmuted as well. So I want to chime in. So here's the thing. And I appreciate watching the Boondocks. If you have not watched the Boondocks, I highly recommend you watch the Boondocks. Aaron Magruder is an interesting character and racial commentary runs throughout it. I absolutely hate Uncle Ruckus. If you don't know who he is, you have to watch it to see what I mean. But here's to the point that I made earlier, and I'm going to make it again. Anti-Blackness is so insidious that you can have some Black people hating Black people. It permeates every single social institution. And again, it is effectively done what it's supposed to do as a system. And you have Black people having negative views towards other Black people. It absolutely, because it's so present and we don't even realize how present it is. And that is why we have to keep having these conversations about race. People often say, like, to have these conversations are divisive. It's not the conversation about race that's divisive. If it had not been for racism, we wouldn't have to have the conversation. But we have to get comfortable with these uncomfortable conversations about race. The conversation absolutely is not the issue. But yeah, blacks feed into the anti-Blackness and don't even sometimes realize it because they drank the Kool-Aid in some kind of ways. And so that's why we got to push back and have some of these conversations and understand how insidious, how it permeates every single social institution. I'm now going to punt it to Rod and let him finish. Rod's my student.
No pressure, Rod. No pressure.
No pressure.
Your grade's not on the line. It's okay.
Not at all.
Just, you know.
I think going back to my earlier point, I think, again, to the question, if minorities can be bigoted, yes, at an individual level, sure, right? But I think it is just so much more helpful to think about things on a higher, sort of larger structure or institutional way, right? Because that's the way racism has evolved, right? You're actually, like, I always tell this to my students too, right? Like, racism doesn't look like what it looked like 30, 40, 50 years ago. It doesn't even look like what it looked like 10 years ago, right? It's evolving every year. And so as such, I wish that the media did a better job of conveying that, right? And talking more about systems and institutions, because I do think that sometimes we get too caught up with individual acts and like don't think larger picture, which means like, you know, looking at other institutions, other markers of inequality that we have in our society that would really point us to the fact that we live in a very racist society. And as Dr. Marsh was also saying, I think people also miss that these things are heavily interlinked. Like anti-Semitism is definitely tied to anti-Blackness, to xenophobia, like, you know, to anti-Asian sentiment, to Islamophobia. These things are interconnected, right? Because the basis of them is white supremacy, right? And so as Dr. Marsh was saying, if we think about things at in an institutional context, Black people, Latinx people, like who are often, you know, we sociologically study them to be at the bottom of different social hierarchies, right? They can contribute to those same institutions, right, and systems. But again, the direction and the way that we think about those things, I think, needs to change a little bit from this very individual kind of emphasis.
Yeah, it's funny, something that you said. Last Tuesday night, we had the privilege of interviewing Rabia Chowdhury. She's the author of the book, Fatty, Fatty, Boom, Boom. She also did the, there we go. It's wonderful. She also, you know, did the HBO specials on Adnan Syed, the young man that was just released up in Baltimore after serving like 23 years for a homicide that he, you know, didn't commit. And part of her book, and I urge everybody, because it's really about, it's a memoir about food, fat, and family. And she is, her family's are immigrants from Pakistan. And she talks about colorism in this book and how prevalent colorism is throughout her society. And we talked about, really, it traces back to sort of colonialism. And so if we look at, right, our self-hate and what we determine, it's not what it's what others have told us is beauty, or right. So it's just, it comes full circle. Well, why is it hard for us? And then there's a question from the audience, but why is it hard for us to admit sometimes that if we are from a minority group or a group of color or a group that is pitted against sort of white supremacy, why is it hard for us to admit that that we too harbor kind of what we're talking about, that we're capable of harboring or even acknowledging? Why?
Go ahead, Rabbi.
Okay. I also have my child has entered the room, so there might be a distraction or two, but it's okay. Yeah. She hears my anti-racism and my anti-Semitism spiel quite often, and my kids could probably they have described it by now, which is kind of sad. Mm-hmm. Yes, we do love our children at events. Yep. One of the things that I think is truly important to lift up in all this is, okay, no, I think she just gave me a bug. That is truly important to lift up in all of this is intersectionality. Right. And that, okay, honey, I need you to stop. That while I am, okay, Rod, you can laugh, fine. That while I am Jewish, I'm also a woman. I go through this world with very white skin. And when I check off the boxes, I check off white. And there's always a part of me in that says, I'm white and think about these other things. But I don't put that in the checkbox. There were times, in my life when I refused to check the box, whatever. Wrote in Ashkenazi Jew, Ashkenazi meaning from my people came from Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine, things like that. And I go through the world with white skin. And one of the best explanations of this as a white Jewish person that I have heard was during a training that we were doing about how to talk about anti-Semitism in progressive spaces. And one of the participants said, we are white. For those of us, for Jews who look, like me, there are Jews of color, there are Jews of who are Asian, who are Black, who are brown, who are all kinds of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And one of the things this participant said, though, is we are white as long as they let us be white. When it's no longer convenient for them, meaning the white supremacists, we stop being white and we start being Jewish. So there's also this question, and I've started to have more conversations about it. When did Jews in America move from Jewish to, for those that look like me, move from Jewish to whiteness? And what happened with our relationships with other communities? And it's a really hard conversation. And when we talk about how are minorities bigoted, for me, I can't ignore that reality. I can't ignore what privileges that I've had and where they've placed me compared to others, and hold that along with all of the anti-Semitism.
Actually, building right off of what Rabbi Abbi was just talking about, in the Muslim community, we're always fascinated because, African-American Muslims, we've been fighting the battle of racism and Islamophobia for decades. And a lot of our friends who, by the census, were white from North Africa or the Middle East, they always like, well, after 9/11, my life changed. And so they're actually an example of a group that went from being white to now being people of color. And so in the last 20 years, for them to actually experience it reverse from how Rabbi Abbi was talking about, and for them to now be like, oh, I'm a person of color. And that community has been fighting hard to get the census changed so that they're not listed as white anymore. But what's funny, 100 years before then, they were okay with it. It was, well, 9/11 changed my life. Yeah, 9/11 did change your life, but it didn't change the life for all Muslims in America. And so it's really always fascinating to see, it goes back to, as Dr. Marsh and Rod talked, it goes back to white supremacy. It's like, how can we be white in America? I have Muslim friends who are children of immigrants who are like, I grew up in, somewhere in the South or in the Midwest or the Southwest, and I didn't even experience racism until, I went to college. Well, your dad was a doctor in town. Of course you wouldn't experience racism. Like, come be with your people. And so I think that that's what comes up a lot, is that minorities are like, they like me. Individual groups like, we're okay. And it's like, okay, but are your brothers and sisters okay? And until we start asking, our brothers and sisters okay, I think that we're always going to be in this vicious cycle of minorities being bigoted towards one another.
Can I add to both what because I completely agree with that. And I think what ends up happening is kind of like the struggle Olympics sometimes. So like when you say something like, the term white privilege, and there are people who are like, I've struggled. How dare you say I am privileged, right? And I think even in the Asian American community, it's like there are certain challenges that we faced. We have our own, generational trauma from, what's happened in our motherlands that, get carried on and passed on to us, that, our parents who don't believe in mental health, they carry that and they continue to pass that on. So it's one of those where they can't see past that sometimes. So it's like, how dare you say that I didn't have a struggle? And that's not what you're saying in acknowledging somebody else's struggle. And it's not what you're saying if you can acknowledge and admit that you do have some privileges, right? There are a lot of Asian Americans in many different situations that are very considered white adjacent, right? And they're seen that way by different communities. And that's what it is. And if you don't acknowledge the realities of that, whether or not you feel like you are, we all present a particular way, and in different situations, we all have different privileges, and being able to know that and navigate those spaces, and just being mindful, like just because I struggled doesn't take away from somebody else's struggle, and acknowledging that doesn't take away from theirs. And I think sometimes certain communities do have a hard time with that. Almost like, it's this, Americans love pie. So it's always like, oh, there's a slice of pie. And it's always like, we got to like chop it up. And it's never that it grows, right? And so giving somebody some more pie doesn't mean that it's taking from my pie, even though that's not the pie we want, right? But you know what I'm saying.
Such a good point. And we like pies and we like boxes, kind of back to what Rabbi Abbi said, like, you have to fit in a box. Heaven forbid that you can fit in like 7 boxes at the same time and not reject one box or think one is better. But no, we have to have boxes and you have to fit squarely in that. And that's it. So,
and Renee, if I can just
please.
to continue that, it's, the Jewish community is feeling a whole lot right now. Its stuff is bad, as I've said, that, anti-Semitism is high. And I am not someone that is typically alarmist, and I'm scared. I am worried. I'm having conversations with my kids about what does this all mean? And a challenge that I see is what happens to me, what happens in my communities when we care so much about what's happening internally to us. And I feel like others on this call have said that about their own communities, that we forget about that other communities are going through stuff too, that this is not, the world doesn't stop just because one group is experiencing hatred. But also in that, I'm not trying to compete with anyone's hatred or anyone's terrible experience or the bigotry that people are experiencing. And in that, I need people to recognize that when I say it's bad, please believe me that it's bad. And I will believe you that it's bad for you. Don't try to quantify my experience in your lens.
That's so good. That is so good. Kind of leads me to another question, because I never want to leave all of us empty-handed, or those listening, but what is it going to take from each of our point of views for each of our minority communities to better support one another? Because that's really what you're talking about, Rabbi Abbi, and to see the symmetry between our diversity, our diverseness, right? And yet we have shared experiences. So what can we do? What can we do to defeat the white supremacist agenda? What can we do? Because really, they won the agenda, right, from like the late 60s until just recently, until George Floyd. How many years was that? Way too many, where we were fractured and we weren't together. So what do you think?
I can start us off. So I really think that, and I'll just speak from, Latinx perspective, right, on things, meaning that I think what's frustrating to watch sometimes is how social groups, racial groups at the bottom of the social hierarchy, including Black people, always stand up for different communities and have to denounce things all the time and show solidarity with other groups of people. But it's been my experience in different organizing circles, in academia, in research, in professional spaces, that Black folks are like the only ones doing that work a lot of times, right? Really forming those bridges with other people, denouncing things, right? Standing really in solidarity with me, with other people that look like me. And it's just frustrating at times to watch that not be reciprocated, right? Like, I'll just give you a quick and easy example, right? Like, I read this piece about the new Black Panther movie, right? And how there's Latinx or indigenous representation now, right? And that comes from a Black director, a Black cast, about a Black movie, right? And here they're giving, non-Black Latinx people a platform, right, that nobody else has given them, other than to play these stereotypical roles, right, as gangbangers, no shade there, or other stereotypes, right, about Latinx men or people, right? And here are Black people, again, sort of doing the work of showing up for us, right? And I just wish I saw that more with non-Black groups. Again, and I see this all the time, I think. Last plug I'll make is for Tanya Hernandez actually just wrote a really excellent book called Racial Innocence, but that's a concept that she uses to talk about why we think like Latinx people are exempt from perpetuating racism and anti-Blackness specifically. But I think that concept is really useful for thinking about, other intergroup relationships.
I've got that. Racial Innocence, Tanya Hernandez. Okay. Who else would like to sort of give us some practical or?
I'm gonna take a shot at it and see what we come up with. I do want to go back to a part of a conversation we were having earlier about colorism, and I appreciate the conversation about how like in Black America in particular, I'm talking about Black America, but colorism permeates. Some Black folks have a preference for lighter skin, and that's kind of on an individual level. But I also want to kind of talk structurally. What we do know is that lighter skinned Black folks earn more. Lighter skinned Black folks have higher education. Lighter skinned Black folks also have higher wealth. So our individual preferences feed into some of these kind of like a structural conversations. So I just want to make sure we don't leave out the structural part of the conversation. Now, the other part I think is really important, and I kind of support everything that Rod is saying. It's been hard to be Black in America forever. And now other groups are starting to kind of understand how hard it is and the terror that we had to live through and are still having to live through. And I appreciate the conversation. This is not about the oppression Olympics. It really is not about the oppression Olympics, but it's been really hard. And we have to keep coming back to the whole notion about anti-Blackness, how we have to think about ways to, one, acknowledge it. Because some people, we're all can understand that, can wrap our minds around it. But some people are going to argue you down that anti-Black sentiment doesn't work. We had a Black president. Just because we had a Black president does not mean we have achieved racial equality or we're all colorblind. I don't see race. I just see the American race. And just to push back against that whole colorblind ideology, it's like, no, you don't want to be colorblind. You want to be color brave or color fair, where I'm not disadvantaged because of my race and someone else is not advantaged because of their race. But we have to keep having the conversation. We all are in some ways are talking to the choir, but there's some people that would argue you down probably on this call that anti-Black sentiments don't run through all of these social institutions. And until we can get to that point and start to dismantle that, we're going to keep having some of these conversations.
Yeah, thank you. Next.
I can go. I will say that my organization is all about education, and I really think we need to start with the young people. My niece is 9, and tomorrow they're having a holiday recital, and they are singing about Christmas, Hanukkah, Ramadan, Diwali. They're singing about everything, and you're just like, it is a Ramadan song? I didn't know we had Ramadan songs. And she's like, yeah, we have a Ramadan song. And do you want to hear me, sing about Hanukkah in Hebrew? And she was just rehearsing. And I was like, wow, it's something that I would have never thought to do that at 9. And they are getting introduced to that at a young age of really being multicultural and being like, oh, it's totally normal for people to have different holidays now. Or for me to not have a holiday right now, but you're still acknowledging the holiday that is coming up. And I think that as soon as we start telling our kids more and more that it's okay to be who you are, you're unapologetically whatever you are, I think that will make a huge difference. Because for too long, we were apologizing. I'm going to apologize for being Muslim. I'm going to apologize for being, middle class. I'm going to apologize for... We have to be unapologetically who we are so that we can stand up and be counted.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think when I was thinking about what's a takeaway that I can leave with people for a conversation like this, I think just to build off what you said, Rahmah, education. And right now, I think last year in session here in Maryland, they had an expensive history curriculum bill that came forward and it was tabled, and I'm hoping that it will be back. And I think we start with that. We need a full education curriculum. We don't want limited education curriculum like we're seeing in Virginia. And we need to advocate for that, because when our children learn about their full histories, they learn about their friends' full histories, we just build that understanding and build that empathy, and also just the celebration of, because there is so much to celebrate. And I think just kind of building off of what Dr. Marsh and Rod also said, the conversations about anti-Blackness need to happen. And I think the emotional labor that I need to do is with my own community and other people who I might be able to have, be in those positions or have a platform to have those conversations. And it is going to be a one conversation at a time. I think a lot of people don't want to see it. And it is very pervasive. And there's not any area of our lives that it's not there. It is 100% there. And so I think it's building on those conversations, building on those relationships, how we can show up for each other, like Rod said, like, how do we do better? Because I know personally for me, I'm constantly in a space of learning. So how do I do better? How do I learn more? How do I just also sit back and just listen sometimes? It is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. I don't think any of this is supposed to be like, but it's also hopeful because we are in spaces like this where we can have the conversations and take it back and sit with it and listen and then figure out like, how do we do better? How do we show up more? Because we all have one common enemy, right? And it is white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And so we have to really fight that together.
Ooh, can I say one more thing?
Please.
Okay. So 2 points. And I want to make sure that I'm real sensitive about this, but I think it's also really important that we're all educated and we all have some kind of like educational background, or we're resourceful. It can't always be, and I'm not saying that Amy is saying this, I'm saying it after Amy, but it can't always be that Black folks are educating other Black folks against race relations. That is exhausting. We are all grown. We all have resources. My father calls it the Google machine. Click Google and find out. We do not have to do all of the educating. And I'm not saying that you're saying that, Amy, but I think it's important to say that. I also think that one of the things that I do work with police officers, and one of the things I talk to police officers about, and I think it's fascinating, and there's a guy named Tim Wise who's been doing some of this anti-racism work for years, this white guy, and he's been doing it for upwards of 25 to 30 years. And one of the things that Tim Wise said, and I thought it was profound, and I want to mention it today, he said, we can talk about every social ill. We could talk about poverty. We could talk about world hunger. We could talk about global warming, whether you believe in it or not. But the one issue people just don't want to talk about is race. Mm-hmm. They think the conversation about race is the issue. Again, if it had not been for racism, we wouldn't have to have the conversation. But every other social issue you want to talk about, but if you just, let's just be real quiet and it'll go away. That's not how that works. To Amy's point, to solidify her point, we really have to get uncomfortable. We have to get comfortable with these uncomfortable conversations about race. They're not always comfortable. And we have to do all of our own due diligence to make sure that we can push the conversation forward.
Yeah.
One of the, someone tuning in tonight in the comments wrote that they had tried to push back against an anti-Jewish slur or trope that was presented by a family member and was told they're too sensitive and they need to, it's just words. Thank you. It's just words, and you don't give the words power. And I think there's something important about, it's not about words having power. It's about how words normalize things. And if we're not speaking up, if we're not doing that education, like you said, Dr. Marsh, if we're not like getting in there and saying, I hear you, and let's talk about what it is you just said and why I said what I said, because yeah, we all need to have that kind of push and pull. I agree. I don't expect people to necessarily educate themselves about anti-Semitism. So if you want me to come over and talk with you about it, or come to your class, or I'm here. I'm happy to do it. This is what I do. And I'm proud to do it. So I know there is that conversation about who should take on the emotional labor. And I am willing to take that on because it is so important to me. And it's a dynamic, I think, to recognize. Some groups do want to be able to talk about it and own it. And then what do I do moving forward? In a training I was in recently, again, about anti-Semitism, there's a theme here, is that they talked about the ripple, and that at the center there's a stone, and I can't necessarily change whatever extreme is in that stone, but I can slow the ripple. And how do I slow the ripple? And, the ripple of negative ideas, conversations, things like, so, how has this conversation tonight slowed a ripple? And that's how I'm framing my work, because this is exhausting. I don't know about all of you, but my therapist told me last night that I'm having the vicarious trauma, and the compassion fatigue that's here. We are so tired, everyone, and this is so hard. So I can only handle one ripple at a time. And I'm glad that I have you all with me handling more.
No, that's beautiful. I think that this conversation is not a one and done. So we will be reaching out to everyone on the panel to see if we can schedule again. Not when Dr. Marsh has been up since 4 a.m. We'll find out when, right? But we thank you so much, each and every one of you that came tonight. Thank you for those that are listening. Thank you for standing by through our power hour outages, going dark, getting kicked off the internet, having Santa fire trucks, and having beautiful little people visit us, right? But we still got it done. So a couple of things. One, please, everyone who's listening, put this on your calendar. January 17th, you will see Rabbi Abbi and Rahmah back again in our continued series, Women in Faith, that we have. So they're part of the panel. And please put March 1st on your calendar, because Dr. Marsh will be with us in person at the Greenbelt Library. She has just written a book, and we're going to talk to her about that. Can you give us the name of the book, or is that still secret, Dr. Marsh?
No, I can give you the name of the book. It's called The Love Jones Cohort, Single and Living Alone in the Black Middle Class, and it's published by Cambridge University Press.
So I'm going to start reading the advanced copy that you gave me so that we can have an intelligent conversation on March 1st with Kyla Hannington.
Yes.
So thank you, Rod. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Dr. Kris. Thank you, Rahmah. Thank you, Rabbi Abbi, for joining us this evening. I want everybody to stay safe throughout this whole season. And thank you, everyone. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.